The house was too quiet the night I finally understood what silence can hide. I remember standing in the hallway, outside Margaret's room, my hand resting on the doorframe, listening. Nothing but the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the faint tick of the old clock on the wall, the one my father gave us as a wedding gift 38 years ago. 38 years. And yet, standing there at 63 years old, I felt like I didn't recognize the house I'd lived in for most of my adult life. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm a retired civil engineer from Newcastle, New South Wales. I spent 40 years building bridges, drainage systems, and infrastructure that would outlast me by centuries. I understood load-bearing structures. I understood what it looked like when something was about to fail. I just never thought I'd have to apply that knowledge to my own family. My wife, Margaret, had been unwell for about 7 months before things came to a head. It started the way these things always do, quietly, without drama. A persistent fatigue that her GP initially put down to anemia. Then, the nausea. Then the trembling hands. She was 61 and had always been the stronger one between us. The one who did the gardening at 6 in the morning and still had energy to cook a roast by Sunday afternoon. Watching her shrink into herself was one of the most frightening experiences of my life. But I told myself it was illness. I told myself the doctors were handling it. Our daughter, Renee, had moved back in to help. She was 34, unmarried, working remotely as a graphic designer. When Margaret's health began declining, Renee offered to take over the daily care, organizing the medications, accompanying her to appointments, making sure she ate properly. My contracting work had picked up unexpectedly. There was a consultancy project in Canberra that required me to travel every fortnight, and I couldn't be in 2 places at once. Renee stepped in. I was grateful. I told her so. I should have paid closer attention to how quickly she made herself indispensable. The first thing I noticed was that Margaret seemed worse after I left for work trips, not better. I'd come back after 4 or 5 days away, and she'd be thinner, more confused, occasionally barely able to string a sentence together. Her specialist put it down to the progression of what they were now calling a neurological condition. Though no one could give me a firm diagnosis, Renee had taken over communicating with the doctors directly, which she said was easier since she was there all day. She'd relay information to me in the evenings, always calm, always measured, always with that same soft expression of concerned devotion that I now understand was something else entirely. The second thing I noticed was that Renee had started locking Margaret's bedroom door at night. She said it was for Mum's comfort. Margaret had apparently told her she slept better without disturbances. But I am a man who has spent 40 years solving engineering problems, and the thing about problems is that once you notice an inconsistency, you cannot unnotice it. The locked door sat in the back of my mind like a stone in a shoe. Then one morning, very early, perhaps 5 o'clock, I got up to use the bathroom and I saw Renee's silhouette moving beneath Margaret's door. Just the shadow of feet, back and forth, back and forth. Slow, deliberate. I stood there in the dark hallway for a long moment, then went back to bed and told myself I was being paranoid. But the next morning, I got up at the same time, and the shadow was there again. I am not a suspicious person by nature. I built a 40-year career on the principle that most problems have rational explanations if you look hard enough. But there is something that happens when a rational man is confronted with an irrational pattern. Something shifts. You stop giving the benefit of the doubt and you start asking different questions. I didn't say anything to Renee. I began to watch instead. Over the following 2 weeks, I paid attention in the way I used to pay attention to bridge inspections, methodically, without assumptions. I noticed that Renee prepared Margaret's evening medication herself and never let me observe the process. I noticed that Margaret's condition seemed to worsen specifically in the 48 hours after I arrived home, and improve very slightly during the brief window when Renee drove into town on Saturdays. I noticed that when I asked to sit with Margaret in the evenings, Renee would find a reason to join us, always positioning herself between Margaret and me, always the one to answer questions on Margaret's behalf. And I noticed that whenever I mentioned taking Margaret to see a different specialist, a neurologist at Royal Newcastle, someone independent of the GP Renee had been dealing with, Renee had a reason it wasn't the right time. Mum is too fragile to travel. The new doctor won't have her history. Let's wait until she stabilizes. There is a particular kind of cold that settles in your chest when you begin to suspect your own child of something unspeakable. It is not anger. Not yet. It is more like the feeling before a storm, the air pressure dropping, everything going very still. I drove to a security shop in Charlestown on a Tuesday afternoon, while Renee was at a design meeting. I told the young man behind the counter that I wanted a small camera, something I could set up discreetly in a bedroom. He showed me 3 options. I bought the smallest one, no bigger than a smoke detector, with a motion sensor and a connection to a phone app. I paid in cash. I installed it that evening while Renee was making dinner, positioning it inside the ventilation grill above Margaret's wardrobe. It wasn't something I was proud of. Standing on the chair, feeding the wire through the grill, I felt a sharp grief not just for what I was doing, but for the fact that I felt it necessary to do it at all. I had built a life around trust in structures, trust in people. Standing in my wife's bedroom, installing a hidden camera on my own daughter, felt like a fundamental betrayal of everything I believed a family should be. But I had a wife who was getting worse, doctors who couldn't explain it, and a daughter who moved through that room every night in the dark. The app connected. The camera came online. I went downstairs and ate dinner with Renee, who told me Margaret had had a good afternoon, that she'd managed some soup and seemed more alert. I smiled and said that was wonderful. That night I waited until Renee's light went off at about 10:30, and then I sat in the small armchair in our study and opened the app on my phone. The footage was grainy but clear enough. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. when Renee's figure appeared in the doorway. She moved quietly, with the confidence of someone who had done this many times. She went to the small table beside the bed where Margaret's nightly drink, a herbal tea that Renee prepared each evening, was sitting. She did something to it. In the low light of the camera, I couldn't see exactly what, but her hands moved over the cup with a deliberate precision that had nothing to do with adjusting a pillow or tucking in a blanket. Then she stood and watched Margaret for a long moment before leaving. I sat in that armchair until 2 in the morning. I watched the footage 3 times. The cold in my chest had become something else. It had become clarity. I want you to understand something about that moment, because people who hear this story often ask why I didn't immediately call 000, why I didn't wake Renee up and confront her, why I didn't rush Margaret to hospital that very night. And the honest answer is that I had about 40 seconds of footage of my daughter standing in a darkened room beside a cup of tea. It was suspicious. It was deeply, viscerally wrong to watch. But it was not yet something that a hospital or a police officer could act on. I am an engineer. I understand that you do not condemn a structure on a visual inspection alone. You need data. You need evidence that can withstand scrutiny. So I didn't confront her. I made a decision to move carefully, because moving carelessly might give her time to dispose of whatever she was using, and then we'd have nothing. The next morning, I called in a personal favor from an old colleague whose son-in-law was a detective with NSW police. I didn't go through official channels yet. I asked for advice, informally, from someone I trusted. I explained what I'd observed over the past 2 months and what I'd seen on the camera. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause. And then he said, "Gerald, get your wife out of that house today. Use any excuse you need, but get her out." I told Renee that Margaret's GP had called while she was in the shower. I fabricated it without hesitation. which is not something I'd have believed myself capable of 6 months earlier, and that the GP wanted Margaret to come in for some urgent blood panels. Renee immediately offered to drive her. I said I'd handle it, that Renee had been doing so much and deserved a morning off, that I'd pick up some groceries on the way home. She hesitated. I watched her calculate. Then she smiled and said, "Of course." That was lovely of me. I had Margaret in the car within 20 minutes. I didn't take her to the GP. I drove to the emergency department at John Hunter Hospital and told the admissions nurse that my wife had been experiencing unexplained neurological decline for 7 months, and that I had reason to believe she may have been poisoned. It is a sentence I never imagined speaking in my lifetime. The next several hours moved in the way that crises move, with a terrible, lurching slowness punctuated by moments of sharp urgency. They took Margaret through immediately. A toxicologist was called. I sat in a waiting room chair with my hands on my knees and stared at the floor and thought about the clock on the wall at home. The one from my father. 38 years. At some point, a nurse offered me a cup of tea. I looked at it for a moment and then said, "No, thank you." The toxicology screening came back in the early afternoon. Margaret had elevated levels of a compound consistent with repeated, low-dose exposure to a heavy metal. The kind of exposure that, over months, produces exactly the neurological presentation her doctors had been chasing. The kind of exposure that, left untreated, has a grim prognosis. The kind that does not occur by accident. The doctor who delivered this information was a young woman, very composed, who placed her hand briefly on my forearm before she started speaking. I remember thinking that she had probably delivered terrible news before, that she had learned how to do it with grace, and that I was grateful for that grace even as the words landed. I called the detective I'd spoken to that morning. He was no longer advising me informally. Within the hour, the matter had been escalated, and 2 detectives were at John Hunter. By early evening, the Australian Federal Police had been contacted because of certain financial irregularities, that the initial investigation had begun to uncover irregularities that I had not yet even begun to comprehend, because I had been so focused on Margaret's health that I had not been looking at our accounts. It turned out I should have been looking at our accounts. While Renee had been managing Margaret's care, she had also, over a period of approximately 5 months, been quietly restructuring access to several of our joint assets. She had convinced Margaret to sign documents during a period when Margaret was, as we now know, significantly cognitively impaired by what she was being given. She had been redirecting funds. She had been in communication with a solicitor in Brisbane who specialized in estate restructuring. The full picture took weeks to emerge, but what became clear early on was that Renee had not acted alone in the financial component. There was another party, someone she had been involved with romantically and financially for over a year, whose name I will not include here out of respect for the ongoing legal process. I drove home that evening to find Renee sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, eating toast, looking entirely undisturbed by the world. She looked up when I came in and asked how Mum was. There was something almost admirable in her composure. If composure is the right word for what a person shows when they have spent months poisoning their mother and have not yet been caught. I told her the doctors had found some things in Mum's blood and that they were keeping her in for observation. I watched Renee's face very carefully as I said it. I saw something flicker there, not guilt, not shame, but calculation. A rapid, practiced calculation. She said that was worrying, that she hoped it wasn't serious, that she should probably call the hospital herself to check on visiting hours. I told her to rest. I said I'd sort everything out tomorrow. 2 hours later, the police arrived. I sat on the back veranda while it happened. I could hear Renee's voice from inside, first measured, then rising. Then a sound I had never heard from her before and which I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I looked out at the back garden, at the hydrangeas Margaret had planted the year we moved in, now in full blue bloom because it had been a wet summer. I thought about all the Sundays we had sat out here together, the three of us sometimes when Renee was younger, and I tried to reconcile that memory with what was happening inside the house. I couldn't. I still can't. Margaret spent 11 days in hospital. The treatment was slow and careful. There were setbacks. There were nights when I sat beside her bed and held her hand and could not imagine a world in which she didn't make it. But she is a stubborn woman, my wife. She always has been. The doctors called her progress remarkable. She came home in early spring, thinner and slower than before, but home. She sat in the garden on the first afternoon and looked at her hydrangeas for a long time without saying anything. Then she reached over and put her hand on mine, and she said, "I knew something wasn't right. I just couldn't hold on to the thought long enough to tell you. I didn't trust myself to speak. Renee is currently facing charges. The legal process is long, and I have been advised not to discuss the specifics publicly. What I can tell you is that the financial investigation revealed a level of premeditation that was the detective's word, which he chose carefully sophisticated. This was not an impulsive act born of desperation. It had been planned across many months, with considerable attention to detail. My daughter, my 34-year-old daughter, who I taught to ride a bike in the car park of Charlestown Square when she was 5, who cried for a week when her first dog died, who I sat beside in the second row at her high school graduation, because the front row was reserved for students and I wanted to be as close as possible, who I helped move into her first flat and assembled her IKEA furniture and ate terrible cheap Thai food with on the floor because there was no table yet. I don't know how to hold both versions of that person at once. I suspect I never will. What I can tell you, and this is the reason I'm speaking about it at all, because I am a private man who has never been comfortable with vulnerability, is that the signs were there. They were there for months before I acted on them, and every week I delayed was another week that Margaret was being harmed. I have had to sit with that. I have had to accept that my instinct to look for the rational explanation, to give the benefit of the doubt, to trust the person in front of me rather than the feeling in my gut that those instincts, good as they generally are, almost cost my wife her life. If you are watching someone you love decline, and something about the explanation you're being given doesn't sit right, don't wait for certainty before you act. You do not need a confession. You do not need proof beyond all reasonable doubt. You need enough concern to make a phone call. One phone call to one person you trust. That is all it takes to begin. I also want to say something about the nature of family and money, because that is ultimately what sat at the heart of this. We had not discussed our estate planning with Renee in any detail. We had never sat down and had the conversation that many parents avoid because it feels morbid, the conversation about what happens when we're gone. Who gets what our wishes are. I don't know whether having that conversation would have changed anything. I suspect that someone willing to do what Renee did would have found a way regardless. But there is something I know now that I wish I had known earlier. Keeping your financial affairs opaque from family members is not protection. It is an invitation to speculation. Have the honest conversation. Put things in writing, with proper legal counsel present. Make sure more than one person has oversight of your affairs if you become incapacitated. These are not romantic things to say. They are not the kinds of things that feel necessary when you are healthy and your family seems ordinary. But I am 63 years old, and I have learned at an enormous cost that ordinary families contain extraordinary secrets, and that love is not always the thing that drives the people closest to us. Margaret and I have started seeing a counselor together, not because our marriage needs repair, if anything. What happened has welded us together in ways I couldn't have anticipated, but because we are both carrying things that are too heavy to carry alone, and we are both old enough to know that asking for help is not weakness. It took me most of my adult life to learn that. I hope it doesn't take you as long. There is one more thing I want to say. In the weeks after the police came, When the story had made its way around our neighborhood the way stories do in a small city, I had several people tell me they were sorry, and I am grateful for that. But the thing that helped me most in those weeks was not sympathy. It was the evening my neighbor Keith came over with a six-pack of beer and sat on the veranda with me and didn't say anything for about 20 minutes, and then said, "You did everything right. You saw it, and you acted on it. That's all any of us can do." He was right. I did act. Later than I should have. But I acted. If there is a bridge to be built between who I was before that night, I installed the camera, and who I am now, it is that one simple truth. You cannot let love for a person excuse what your eyes are showing you. You cannot let the version of someone you built in your memory blind you to the version standing in front of you. Family is not a reason to look away. Sometimes, and God help us, this is the hardest thing I have ever had to say sometimes. Family is precisely the reason you must look more carefully. Margaret's hydrangeas are blooming again. She is in the garden most mornings now, slower than before. With a walking frame she has decorated with a small sticker of a golden wattle. I watch her sometimes from the kitchen window while I make the tea, real tea, just tea, the way it always should have been. And I think about the 38 years behind us and whatever years are still ahead. We are still here. That is not nothing. In fact, right now, that feels like everything.